I call to order our Public Safety Funding Committee for September 12th, 2024. Thank you for being here. And we'll look to our director to conduct a roll call.
Chair Lewis.
Here.
Councilman Robinson.
Here.
Chief Butler.
Here.
Chief Tobin.
Here.
Jason Baran.
Here.
Orsa Calderon. Kimber Lanning. Dr. Noggle.
Here.
And Barbara Roderick. All right, Mr. Chair, we have a quorum.
Thank you. We do have a quorum. So we will move to agenda item number 3 and request a motion to approve the minutes from August 29th, 2024.
I'll move that.
Okay.
Second.
We have a motion second. All in favor of approving the minutes, please say aye.
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 Any
Aye.
opposed? Thank you. We did not receive any public comments, and on the agenda, it continues to provide opportunities for the public to make some comments. Before we move to presentation number 5, I'll just say this by way of, I'll put it into the welcome category. I live in Gilbert, and Gilbert happens to have a 9/11 memorial. You're invited to come see it sometime. It's right in front of the entrance to Town Hall, and it's an 8-foot beam that came from the World Trade Center. And it's been put on a monument stand that makes it so young children can come and touch it, and it's the spot where we do our 9/11 memorial ceremony each year. And I was there last night, and I was thinking about this group and thinking about individuals who, Don and Barbara, served for years in the county and helping public safety. And this is a public safety committee. And Chief Tobin thought of you in your role. Chief Butler thought of you. And then other committee members and even Councilmember Robinson and all your efforts with public safety. So I just take a moment to thank this committee, as yesterday was an opportunity for our communities to remember our first responders and our veterans, those in the military, those who serve and make us safe. So thank you. And that was kind of a 1A. Okay, let's go to 5 before I'm out of order. We have a presentation on the subject of per diem overview. Ben Schuyler, Doug Campbell will turn to you from MGT.
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all today. I'm Brett Schleier. I'm a vice president with MGT. And also joining us from MGT is Doug Campbell. He is a managing consultant. Both of us are actively working on the update of this county jail per diem calculation based on the budgets for fiscal year 25. But we're wanted to have a presentation here for you today to give you all a glimpse into last year's calculation and what the methodology is that we follow, and be able to allow you all to ask questions either today or to kind of look more at the information, have a better understanding of the process, and provide input going forward. All right. So just a brief background on MGT. I introduced both myself and Doug. MGT is a national consulting firm that's really focused on public sector service, state and local governments, as well as PK through 12 school districts and universities. Everything from the type of financial work that we're doing here for the sheriff's office to IT, cybersecurity, infrastructure, people and organization type work, strategy, planning, leadership. So we do annually anywhere between maybe 2 and 5 projects for Maricopa County each year. I think right now we have 3 projects going on, about to add a 4th. So we're pretty regular providers to the county. Today, I want to focus on the jail per diem calculation. So this is an annual project that's been ongoing for a number of years now, where we are effectively preparing an activity-based cost of service calculation that gets updated annually, with the end goal being to identify the total costs of housing inmates in the Maricopa County Jail, as well as a daily rate, so a rate per day per person, and the costs of doing booking or intake services into the detention facilities. Okay. The total costs that we're identifying in our calculation come from a variety of sources. We've got costs coming from the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office. We've got costs coming from the County Correctional Health Services Organization, as well as county-wide costs. That costs of administration and support from other county departments that are provided in support of the Sheriff's Office and Correctional Health Services, and those are identified by the countywide cost allocation plan that's prepared out of the Finance Office each year. The calculations in the jail per diem study are based on budgeted expenditures each year, but we do make adjustments for budget variances in the most recently completed actual fiscal year. So we're using budget so that we're trying to reflect what costs are going to be in a coming year, because that's the fiscal year we're trying to set rates for, but we're effectively doing a true up of prior years by including those previous year budget variances in our calculations. Getting an Amber Alert coming into my phone. The way that the project works is each fall, we begin the process and we review and analyze the Sheriff's Office and Correctional Health Services activities. The calculations tend to be very similar from one year to the next. Like, we're using the same methodology year after year, as long as it continues to be appropriate. Making changes where there's changes to the way that services are provided, or that the Sheriff's Office or Correctional Health Services is organized. Anytime that there's a new unit added to either of those organizations, we're doing an assessment on it to determine how it should be treated. We're assigning or allocating all of the Sheriff's Office costs into 4 broad categories: intake or booking activities, custody of prisoner activities, and then extradition related activities and enforcement related activities. The extradition and the enforcement don't get incorporated into the daily rate to house prisoners in the facility, and they don't get incorporated into the booking or intake costs either. We're also assigning or allocating all of those correctional health services costs into 3 different categories for them. There's costs related to intake and booking, costs related to custody or inmates that are in custody, and then costs that are outside medical services, costs that we're paying when an inmate needs to go to a health facility outside of the detention centers. And then the last piece of the calculation each year is a determination of the number of actual prisoner bookings and housing days. At its most basic, you can think of this as a calculation kind of as a ratio where we're determining the total costs of housing individuals in the jail, and then dividing that into the number of inmate days for individuals in the facility to determine what that housing rate would be. Okay. So the housing rate that was established for fiscal year 25, and this would have been based on fiscal year 24 budget. As I mentioned, total cost of housing divided into the number of housing days. There's just over $326 million of cost, a little more than 2.4 million prisoner days during the year. So the average daily rate comes out to $132.09. The booking rate for fiscal year 25 costs of about $51.5 million. There was about 80,000 inmates booked into the facility during that fiscal year to establish a booking rate of $640.29. I'm happy to provide more details, answer some questions from you all if you want to get into more specifics. But that is the overview of how the daily rate calculation works each year.
Thank you, Ben. To the committee, do you have questions or comments you'd like to make?
Yeah, I'm just wondering how that compares to the past 3 or 4 years.
To the past 3 or 4 years. Let me pull up a file. So handy, I just have the 1 year prior that I'm looking at. And like 1 year prior, the booking rate was $642 almost. And the housing rate was $128. Just from memory, the rates tend to be very consistent from year to year. They don't tend to vary all that much. Spending within the sheriff's office has been relatively consistent over time. The number of inmates isn't radically changing from 1 year to the next. So these rates tend to be relatively stable.
Thank you.
And when we provide the report, there's both a written report that includes the tables that summarize all the costs. There are Excel files that show comparisons and trends across time. And there's also a rate manual that gets prepared that describes the process that needs to be followed, what the components are, what the source of all the data is that goes into the calculations. So the staff that are involved in the sheriff's office and in the finance office also have a lot more detail than what we've presented here today.
A similar question. As you look at those figures and with your experience across the country, are they similar to other states, other counties? Are they high, low? Is there anything the committee needs to be aware of related to the numbers? In other words, in your assessment, are they reasonable?
I think costs are reasonable. These get used to charge a lot of the local jurisdictions that are housing inmates in your facility. They're reviewing these calculations each year. I think you'd be getting more pushback if they didn't think that the costs were reasonable as well. Your booking rate is very similar to what I see all across the U.S. Booking rates tend to be very high. It's kind of an intensive process. There's a lot of eyes and hands on inmates in those in that first day as that classification process takes place. an initial medical review, all of that tends to make the initial intake process pretty expensive. Your housing rate of 132.09 is higher than what I see in most other jails that we do calculations for, but we don't do an immense number of these calculations. Like we're doing, a couple dozen of these a year, where we're seeing calculating per diem costs, but you are on the higher side of the calculations that we see.
Thank you. Other questions or comments from the committee?
I have a question, Mr. Chair. What is the pertinence of this information to us? Like, why is this being presented? What does this mean to us moving forward? Where are we with that? I'm just trying to get the relevance.
Yeah, so I can take that, Mr. Chair.
Please.
So there just are limited funding sources into the detention fund. So the jail excise tax is about half of it. The maintenance of effort is about half of it, and the other sliver is this per diem that we get from cities and towns. It's a little less than 5%. So this is just kind of the last standing revenue source into the detention fund that we haven't talked about yet. It's just that 5% that cities and towns pay in order to check through the ITR and book them overnight.
Okay, I see. So one other question on just to how we get to this number and not being critical, but basically you're taking intake, custody, and outside medical services, and you're dividing all of those costs by the number of days for each inmate. Is that how, I think that's what you showed, right?
At a very basic level, that is exactly what's happening. Yes.
Is that a fair way to, so you're taking an average, right? I could do that. If you gave me those numbers, I could give you that average. Is that the fair way to do it or the most relevant way to do it? Because there's surges, there's sometimes you're more, sometimes you're less, but the costs are the same. The inmates are lower or the inmates are higher, the costs are the same. That would be an average. Is there a reason that we just do an average, or is there a better way to go about coming up with that number than just that simple math? That's a rhetorical question. So.
Yeah, understood. So using an average cost is historically the kind of best practice all across the nation. It's how the U.S. Marshal Service required calculations to be years ago, and it's how ICE, Immigration's Custom Enforcement, now requires calculations to be when they use them. They're not tied to actual costs in many cases. They have ability to negotiate. But you're right that the actual cost of any individual inmate, whether it's because of the timing of when they're in the facility or maybe some special health needs that they might have, is going to be different. One of the reasons that, and over time, like a few years back, it would probably be about 6 years ago now, we did some additional breakouts of the rate calculations where we were determining, especially on the health side, trying to determine whether to kind of bifurcate the rate into individuals that needed mental health support in addition to kind of physical or bodily health support. And one of the issues with it is how you then implement it. Like, when you're looking back on the history of your inmates and what kind of mix of people that you had and what the cost was, you can assign kind of a different level of cost to different groups of inmates there. But the issue is that when you establish those rates and then you're trying to use them in real time, being able to classify an inmate into one of those particular categories becomes very difficult. Because while the day they walk in the door, they might be in one medical category, by the time that they leave the facility, they may be in another. And so you're potentially looking at, kind of different rates on a per day basis, based on, as somebody's health improves or erodes over the course of their stay. And you have combined with that, like you mentioned, the fluctuation in the population of the jail itself, that you have to be cognizant of in real time. So the complication of the implementation of any kind of a more detailed rate scheme is really what keeps using average cost as the best practice.
Thank you. Councilmember Robinson, we see your hand raised, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I think Mr. Schiller may have just answered my question for me a little bit. I was curious as to whether or not some inmates, especially in this day and age, seems like we have more with different mental issues and health issues and stuff like that. Does that lower, I mean, does that change the calculation at all? That was one part of the question. The other part of the question I would ask is there a different, who pays when it's a misdemeanor? I know the cities or the whoever's booking that agency pays, but is it the same thing with felonies? And Danny, that might be a question for you to answer.
Yeah, I'm not sure on who pays, so I'll have to defer in that case. But you're right with mental health becoming such a larger issue over time, whether it's our focus on it or just increased issues that individuals have, it has driven costs up in correctional facilities kind of all across the U.S. Like I mentioned, a few years back, we tried to segregate mental health costs from other health-related costs to create different classes of inmates to establish different rates. And it just, while we could do the calculations, in arrears, it wasn't workable on a go-forward basis.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, I think maybe Kirsten from our budget office might be able to give a little more insight into the second part of that question.
Please, Kirsten.
Yes, just to answer, get this right, answer the felony piece of the question, if a prisoner is going through our Maricopa County judicial branch and through Superior Court, it would end up being a county cost to pay for that inmate.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
One quick question, I guess, for clarity. Is the housing rate and the booking rate charged to the community as the individual comes in on the first day, or is there a triggering event that would cause the housing component to be charged for one but not for another person, like an arraignment or remanded to custody, or is it just everybody gets the first day and costs associated with that? Or can you help me understand that a little bit?
So I think I can help with that. I think it depends on the time of day. So we do charge for partial days as well. And then for a housing rate as well, it's almost broken up into like thirds of the day that someone would get charged.
Thank you.
Brian?
Can I go back a little bit? So I'm now going to go to medical services. One of the things that we learned in the tours was how things had changed so drastically with the medical services that are provided at the facilities. Some of those, and there's two different facilities with two different, obviously very clearly different opportunities for that to be done well, and I know that's one of the things we're looking at. So I guess my question is about policy. So there was a time that we policy shift, mostly by lawsuits, I guess, and the judicial system, and we made a much larger investment into the medical services that we provide to inmates. So a policy perspective then increased costs pretty significantly to the county to provide those new services that were required through policy. So I would be interested to, I guess I'm just trying to dial down into this a little bit and make sure that if we need this relevant number, that we're making sure that there's a buffer for additional changes down the road. We saw a lot of those changes with mental health services and just general health services for inmates going up as a result of some of that policy. So is there a cushion here that you don't want to be too tight with it? Because then if a new policy comes in, there's a new change, and I don't know, there are different people that get elected between now and probably the end of this potential excise tax. So is there some other is this adequate for what we're looking for to make the choices that we need to for how much the county needs moving forward is just the general question. I don't know whether, I see where the math come from, as it was explained properly that that's where we got it, but is it adequate for what we need to do, or is it not adequate?
Yeah, so it's based on your most recent budget each year when we're doing the calculations. So, and it gets revisited each and every year. So there is always the possibility that policy could change sometime mid-year, and then your budget needs to be revised, and you outspend your budget in a material way, to where the rates that were initially calculated may then not be appropriate for what the actual spending that's occurring in the year is. But we also have that true-up component to the calculation, where we look at the prior year's budget compared to the actuals, and any variance there gets built into the rates. So if that were to occur, policy changes, we overspend budget by $50 million in terms of how it impacts the rates. The rates during that year would be lower than what the real cost experience was. But when the next rate calculation comes around, the budget would theoretically be at a higher rate to handle those new policy decisions. And we would be incorporating kind of that overspend from the prior year, that $50 million that wasn't in the original rate calculation. So the next year's rates would have kind of a catch-up component into it to make you whole.
And I can just add to that a little bit, because we do get the per diem rate from MGT, and we evaluate what that rate is and the impact that it may have on cities. And so we have done certain things in recent years if the rate has gone too high to try to mitigate that impact. So with CARES, we received a significant amount of funding, and we were able to offset some of our public safety expenditures. And we gave cities a credit because we were receiving that benefit. Also, it had impacted them because during COVID, our jail population decreased somewhat significantly. And so that if your denominator goes down, your rate is going to go up. And so that was why we helped give them that CARES offsets, that they weren't experiencing a huge impact because of that. The reduction based on prior year expenditures is recent, because I think, as you've heard us say, there's some savings in the sheriff's office budget from year to year. So we aren't trying to recover costs that the sheriff's office isn't even spending. And then one of the other things we've also done in recent years is, because sometimes the jail population can change from year to year, we have started doing a 5-year average as well to kind of smooth out if there may be variances from year to year.
Okay. Kirsten, you're in a good spot, because we're going, thank you for helping us with agenda item number 5. We'll now move to agenda item number 6. Capital project funding, and from our County Office of Budget and Finance, Kirsten Prindle. And Kirsten, is Mike also here?
Mike is online. So Mike, I don't know if you wanted to make a couple of comments before we get started.
So if you hear another voice, that is Mike McGee.
Yeah. Yeah, this is Mike McGee, the Chief Financial Officer. I'm happy to be here, and what Kirsten will be presenting to you is our capital improvement program for the county, which will kind of specifically walk you through the process that we have for the county in not just jail facilities, but all their other capital improvements. So I'll turn it over to you, Kirsten, and then I'm happy to answer any questions, and so is Kirsten.
Thank you. Please.
All right. So as Mike said, today I will be providing an overview of the capital improvement program and how the county funds the capital improvement projects. So the 4 types of county projects, excluding districts, because we do have flood control and library district with their own capital projects, would be facilities, technology, transportation, and parks. In this presentation, I am going to focus more on facilities projects and what defines that process, because most of the projects in the detention fund are facilities related. And then the only other category that we would utilize the detention fund would be technology projects, and we do have a couple of those. So a capital improvement program is defined as a major non-recurring project that includes acquisition of or improvement of a land for a public purpose, construction of a new facility or addition, major rehabilitation that increases the service potential of the building, and the planning, feasibility, engineering, or design of a capital improvement project or projects. And so on this slide, I just have a flow chart that illustrates our approval process for facilities projects. So the first step would be a department submits a detailed business plan to the facilities, or a capital project is identified and FMD creates the business plan. So departments will submit projects for improvements to existing building or a proposal for a new building. So just to kind of give you an example of each, recently the Sheriff's Office had submitted a capital project request to increase security hardening in their building. And then a county capital project would be implementation of a project that has been identified as a need, really like the jail master plan. No individual department. We wouldn't make the Sheriff's Office fully submit the plan with that. They'd probably be more of a collaborator on that. And then once FMD reviews that the detailed business plan has been completed fully and accurately, the projects are brought to what we call the Facilities Review Committee, or FRC, and our FRC meets regularly to review and prioritize projects. And then the top projects will move forward to design phase once approved by the county manager and FRC. Then the Board of Supervisors, Chiefs of Staff are briefed on the projects. FMD then receives a budget to commission design for the project, and then once that is complete, FMD will present the budget estimate and any future operating costs to the FRC. And then during budget development in February, our office will provide the estimated available funding for the next fiscal year, and the project's budget estimates are evaluated against available funding. And I'll go over how we determine available funding in future slides. Facilities will then brief the board offices on the FRC-approved projects for tentative budget adoption. And then finally, we do our budget presentation to the board, budget adoption, and funding is in place for the upcoming fiscal year. So county budget appropriations are classified as either operating or non-recurring. Simplistically, operating expenditures are ongoing costs that the county incurs, and non-recurring are one-time costs that will not continue past the current fiscal year or a limited number of fiscal years. The board-approved budget guidelines and priorities require the Office of Budget and Finance to develop a structurally balanced budget. This means that our ongoing revenues must meet or exceed ongoing expenditures. The fund balance can only be used for one-time expenditures like a building and cannot fund ongoing expenditures such as personnel costs. So on this slide, I wanted to illustrate the operating and non-recurring for the detention fund budget, and this is for fiscal year 25. And so the jail tax, maintenance of effort transfer, jail per diem, and other revenues only fund our operational expenditures. The majority of costs are for positions, followed by services, supplies, capital, and transfers. And then our non-recurring costs are supported by available fund balance, which again, I'll kind of go over how we accumulate that fund balance in future slides. And so I also just gave you some detail of the fund balance to kind of see what non-recurring items we've been using the detention fund for. So in fiscal year 25, we did set aside some funding in our reserves. This will allow us to sustain operations in fiscal year 27 if the jail tax is not extended. But if it is extended, we actually plan to use this to help fund that jail master plan. So we're already working on setting aside some funding. Other costs are repayment of our capital lease debt, our computer refresh, vehicle and equipment replacement, major maintenance projects, and carry forward of any one-time items that were not able to be purchased in the prior year. And then finally, one of our county strategic goals is to maintain reserves equal to 2 months of the prior year operating expenditures, and we add or remove funding each year to maintain that. So the county uses a modified pay-as-you-go capital funding strategy. We only approve projects if we have the fund balance available. However, we use debt financing for the bulk of our facilities and technology projects in the form of certificates of participation in order to remain under the expenditure limit. During budget preparation, we identify new projects for financing, and then we organize the projects in separate funds for each debt issuance. And then all of the funding to repay the debt is set aside in reserves. So to try to illustrate that, let's say we have $300 million in capital projects that we would like to fund in the next fiscal year. We will put those projects in a separate fund. When we go out for debt, we receive the $300 million in proceeds from the debt in that fund, and it is used to pay for those capital projects. At the same time, we are also transferring money into our reserves to set aside to be able to repay all of that debt. And then depending on the debt repayment schedule, we will transfer the funds to our debt fund to repay that debt that we have used for the capital projects. So it's a little confusing, but we always make sure that we set aside the money to repay the debt because we do a pay-as-you-go plan for capital projects. Yeah.
You explain that, and I'll circle one more time.
Yep. So if we go out, if we have $300 million in capital projects that we are approving for the next fiscal year, we budget for those capital projects in a separate fund. And then we will go out for debt for $300 million to pay for those capital projects. The proceeds from that debt issuance get deposited in that fund, and they pay for all of those capital projects. Separately, we have $300 million to pay for those projects, but instead, we use that $300 million to repay the debt. So we set it aside in our reserves, and then based on the payment schedule, we repay the debt each year. And we typically, because we have the funds available, are able to repay the debt within about a 2-year time frame for each debt issuance.
Don't have early payment penalties on your COPs?
No, we don't have early payment. As long as it's a year, it's considered debt if it goes past the 1-year mark. And so we try to do quick terms because it also keeps our interest payment low because we are incurring an additional cost having to do it this way. But it is our strategy to remain under the expenditure limitation. And I'm sorry, I'm not an expert on certificates of participation either, but just to kind of give you an overview of what they are, certificates of participation are a form of tax-exempt security that closely resembles bonds, and they are collateralized by essential county property. So we have been currently using our South Court Tower to collateralize all of the property because it's quite expensive building. And so investors are given a certificate that entitles them to a share or participation in the lease principal and interest payments on a given maturity date. And then, as I said, payment of debt is funded by existing revenues reserves, and the county's obligation to make lease payments is subject to annual appropriations made by the county for that purpose. In coordination with the board, county manager, and CFO, the county's financial advisors makes recommendations for a financing strategy. And then in order to be tax exempt, the proceeds must be used to finance capital costs. And as I said, we use this debt financing strategy as a mechanism to fund capital projects outside of the constitutional expenditure limitation. So during budget development each year, we calculate how much fund balance we have accumulated to be able to fund one-time non-recurring expenditures. And we casually call this pickup. So each year we do a forecast in February where we analyze how much revenue we expect to receive and how much we anticipate to spend for every department. And then this forecast is utilized in our fund balance review. And the pickup is made of the following. It's prior year actual revenues greater than forecasted revenues, actual expenditures less than forecasted expenditures, and then in the current year, it is current year forecasted revenues greater than budgeted revenues and forecasted expenditures less than budgeted revenues. And then just one other thing I want to mention for fund balance is that in some years, when we do have greater pickup, we try to plan for future projects because some years are good, some years are bad, but we do have some capital projects that we know we need to get through. And so we want to have reserves set aside to be able to do those if we don't have as much capital project funding in a future year. And so one of the examples is the Melendres court order has required us to redo all of our sheriff's office substations. And so each year, if I have more pickup available, I'm trying to set aside the reserve for the next substation if it's possible. So this is a visual representation of our calculated pickup for fiscal year 25 for the general and detention fund. One thing to keep in mind is we can use the general fund for detention fund expenditures, and we do, but we cannot use the detention fund for general fund expenditures. So we are able to use this total pickup amount for the detention fund costs. Starting with the prior year, which would have been fiscal year 23 for the FY 2025 budget, our revenues came in $26.6 million greater than forecasted, and our expenditures were $6.3 million more than forecasted. One of the first things we do with our pickup is we set aside that funding we need to maintain our 2 months operating reserves. And so for our FY23 pickup, we were actually negative $11 million. And then in FY24, we compare the budget to that estimated forecast we do in February. Our revenues were estimated to be $201.2 million greater than budget, and expenditures at $278.1 million less than budget. A portion of those expenditures are for one-time items, so that credit of $115.6 million is what we call carry forward for items that have not been purchased yet and departments need them to continue into the next fiscal year. Our FY24 total pickup was $363.7 million, and our total pickup came out to $352.8 million. So that is what we had available in FY25 for capital projects and one-time expenditures. And we are a little bit strategic with our trying to ensure that we do have some pickup in the next fiscal year, and that we try to conservatively budget our revenue growth. So we use a contracted economist for our major revenues, and he gives us multiple scenarios of revenue growth. So we do typically use pessimistic. So if revenues come in higher than that, we're able to use them for one-time expenditures. And it's also a strategy to keep our operating budget growth lower. The county's 5-year capital improvement program budget currently is approximately $1.1 billion. Of that total, $633.8 million has been funded by the General and Detention Fund. $403.9 million has been funded by highway user revenues, and $13.2 million has been funded by ARPA. And then this pie chart is just an illustration of the FY 2025 budget of $456.1 million by category. The largest category of expenditures is public safety, followed by general government, highways and streets, health, welfare, and sanitation, and culture and recreation or parks. And then by project type, facilities projects are 51.35% of the total. Transportation projects are 38.43%, technology projects are 6.7%, and parks are 3.6%. And then this was presented to you in our last meeting, which was the jail master plan cost summary. And so we kind of wanted to go over this because we know the costs are significant, but this is something that the county would be doing over time and implementing the same strategies that we have been implementing, where we're able to save money and fund these capital projects as we go. And this is how we were able to fund the $180 million for our intake transfer release jail as well. And we are actively working now to try to fund the jail master plan. If we don't need that one-time funding, it will go towards the jail master plan. And then the county also had a portion of its budget that it had been using for us to pay down our unfunded pension liability. We are hoping to get to 100% with the funding that we have given to the pension system for corrections officers and public safety personnel. And so we would be able to redirect that as well in order to help fund the jail master plan. So that is my presentation for you today. I know I threw a lot of numbers at you, but if you have any questions.
From the committee, questions, comments?
I wasn't at the last meeting, but I saw that there were some needs at both 4th Avenue and LBJ to address some amount of rehabilitation of those buildings. But I don't see that in here. Is that going to simply be in current ongoing?
Yeah, I'm sure. I don't know specifically, but we are meeting in our next meeting for the FRC in October, so I'm sure something like that will most likely come up. There also is, if it's not a major rehabilitation that would qualify for a county capital project, facilities has a major maintenance budget where they're also actively working on different upgrades to buildings as well.
Yeah, thank you.
And Mr. Chair, Dr. Noggle, I do think that there's some of that stuff that's also in this maintenance and improvements of existing facilities line. I know that they had a part of it portioned out for not new things, but continuing to maintain. And so that might be in that $40 million there.
Mr. Chair, can you help me understand where we draw the line on what's major versus minor?
We're working on really defining that better, but I think really it's a sort of like the admin building as an example. We're doing a full rehabilitation from floor to floor, and so that's being considered a capital project, but just replacing. But just replacing the elevators in the building would be major maintenance.
Thanks.
Mike, is there anything else that you wanted to add?
No, the only thing that I would probably add is that as you see, a lot of the construction, a lot of these capital projects are funded by this pickup, this one-time money that we pick up each year. And if we have years where there's just not very much pickup, that affects our capital planning tremendously. And I will tell you that over the past year, we've noticed that sales tax revenue growth has been slowing. In fact, it's almost flat right now. And so I anticipate that that pickup that we generally get from budgeting low for revenues, we're actually coming in closer to budgeted and might not have as much pickup as we have historically. So it's things like that that you have to be mindful of when we're doing this long-term planning, is that you might have some ups and downs in available funding.
Thank you. And we will now move to agenda items 7 and 8. Paige Gonzalez, a consultant to the Public Safety Funding Committee. On agenda item 7, will talk to us about the 1997 committee recommendations. And after that, Paige, you'll just move right into agenda item 8.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon, everyone.
For the record, I'm Paige Gonzalez. I'm with Monte Vista Policy, and I am on board to help you all as a committee and county administration as you work toward all the things related to the jail tax extension. And so I'm going to present to you today what the committee, much like yourselves from 1997, 9 citizen members appointed to a committee, what those members recommended to the Board of Supervisors at the time, and give you a status of all of those recommendations. And back in April, you had received a history of what the committee was, what they were assigned to do, and all of, just kind of a summary of what their work was. So Danny and I were thinking that by presenting this to you today, it'll help you think through the next several meetings what you might want to recommend to the board, because we're at that point in the process, I think. So the recommendations you're going to see were from the Jail Citizens Advisory Committee on Jail Planning. And there were 10 core recommendations that were produced by the committee, and they were submitted to the board after considering consultants' proposals as well. And interestingly, these recommendations were intended to save costs and decrease future bed needs. So keep that in mind as we're going through here. And to help myself, I kind of put these in 5 categories, these recommendations. One was to consolidate data. The next was to establish efficiencies in case management, proceedings, and staffings, and improve and expand pretrial services, enhance substance abuse programming, and of course, expand jail capacity. And I'll start by saying that the statuses of all these is positive as I start going through these recommendations. I put this slide up here just as a citation for all of us. At the very end of their report, the committee also recommended that the board appoint a Citizens Jail Oversight Committee to help kind of guide the process, the implementation, make sure that promises were made and kept from what the board adopted. And so this was poring over their minutes over years, and also thank you to all the departments that have answered our questions so we could get an appropriate status for all of you on these. And the committee met through 99 to 2005. So let's get started. There we go. Okay. The first recommendation was an integrated criminal justice information system. So the idea was that if the county had implemented this system, integrating criminal justice data, it would eliminate duplication of effort, staffing efficiencies would be seen, and also the data could be used for appropriate jail population management decisions. And to be clear about these efforts, this was about data sharing within local agencies, law enforcement agencies. So local police, sheriffs, DPS, and it was creating common case numbers, sharing criminal history data, and it was also to be used internally with adult probation, the courts, county attorney's office, and the sheriff. So good news on this front, ICJIS, which you've heard about in the past. ICJIS is a department. It was established using jail excise tax funds, and it receives $2 million from detention fund every year for maintenance and operation. Recommendation 2 was to implement differentiated case management. So this is a tool and a technique that the courts use to tailor case management for different, individual cases. And the idea was that if this was accomplished, there'd be fewer continuances, fewer bench warrants due to failure to appear, and reduced pretrial detention costs. So this was not new to the county. It looks like the Superior Court had already used this for domestic relations cases. So the idea was to just expand the purview of this. And so the court and county leaders did create a tailored case flow management system. And it was about specifically for lower level drug related cases. And the efforts were to provide more opportunities for the detainees and also a quicker resolution. So those were all positive, and that was done. Recommendation 3 was to eliminate unnecessary court proceedings. So this is a key component of the slide I just presented to you for case differentiation. So the idea was to consider pursuing a rule change. So this was the county asking the courts to consider a rule change, to allow JPs to accept pleas in felony cases, and send commissioners to regional justice centers for arraignments or utilize video conferencing instead of everybody being in 25 plus different places. So this would assist with case processing, decreasing that amount of time, and also, in general, it was to help with differentiated case management, as I mentioned. So beginning in 2000, the Arizona Judicial Council established a committee on Superior Court just to oversee their kind of operations and kind of review how they did things procedurally. And so they did begin taking the necessary steps for this particular recommendations, and filings were regionalized to 4 facilities, which gained processing efficiencies. And after that was up and running, additional orders in 2002 by the administrative order of the court enabled direct filing to the Supreme Court. Recommendation 4 was to move the Southeast criminal divisions to downtown. So this one was about reducing inmate transports. That would be a better use of staff efficiencies there, but also enhancing public safety so those transports didn't have to occur. So effective with the South Court Tower opening in 2012, which is just near us here, all the criminal divisions were consolidated into the downtown campus. And with the exception of the initial appearances in Durango, which you all saw in your tours, all Superior Court judges and court commissioners handling criminal cases are located at the South Court Tower and the Central Court building here in downtown Phoenix on the county campus. Recommendation 5 was to expand pretrial services. So the idea here was expanding the pretrial services program by adding positions, and they were very specific about 32 positions, would enable the caseloads to be increased, more people to be served, up to 1,200 people. So as you heard adult probation, they came and presented to you all in May about their department and all their pretrial initial appearance and supervision functions. Currently, they have 27 staff that have completed 51,000 initial appearance reports and 57 staff with a pretrial supervision caseload of 2,603 this year. Recommendation 6 was also very specific. It was about implementing electronic monitoring. So the committee recommended to the county board that they purchase 50 units and then expand that to 150 units by 2012. And so in June of this year, the electronic monitoring program consists of 973 individuals supervised by 40 officers, 4 supervisors. And so the initial recommendation was very specific to an amount. Really, the county and the courts worked together to establish an appropriate caseload, make sure that everyone was effectively supervised, and that kind of explains how that number changed, and it was an improvement since then. Recommendation 7 was to fund a study to revalidate a bail matrix. And so the terminology was a little different in our findings here, in that really what we call this is a pretrial risk assessment. And the risk assessment provides the court information to determine release decisions and release conditions, and to assist the pretrial services staff with supervision monitoring requirements. So yes, the study was funded. The idea was that it would enhance public safety to make sure this is a valid tool, instill faith in the judiciary that they're making the appropriate decisions, and also serve as a basis for continuing to expand pretrial services, which reduces jail and capital costs. Jail capital and operating costs. So yes, this was approved by the Supreme Court's Arizona Code Judicial Administration, and it has been validated, the risk assessment tool. Okay. Recommendation 8 was to fund substance abuse evaluation and programming. This committee has heard a lot about this over the past many meetings, and so while I can't speak specifically to all these programs, the idea was, yes, the county should be investing in substance abuse evaluation and programming, and that this recommendation would reduce the number of sentenced offenders awaiting eval and placement. So at the time of the report in 1997, nationwide criminal justice agencies were saying substance abuse needs to be addressed. And so this was a recommendation, and as you have seen, the county has and will continue to invest in these many programs that you've heard from both correctional health and the sheriff's office. Recommendation 9 was to modify the drug court to include pre-adjudicated offenders and broaden the category for those that qualify for the program. And the pre-adjudication would be less restrictive criteria, allowing for early release from jail. So this was interesting to read through all the minutes. It was a little bit controversial in that committee members went back and forth about the efficacy or who would pay for it, et cetera. But what we have found is that while there isn't like a pre-conviction drug court necessarily from this recommendation, there are diversion programs, obviously, within the county attorney's office. So specifically, if a person is charged with a felony offense based on certain criteria, drug-related, it's all in the statute that I listed up there also, and within their policies, that person would qualify for a diversion. And so if successful, the person would be successful, the charges would be dismissed with prejudice, which means they couldn't come back. But if the person's unsuccessful, prosecution would resume. So that was accomplished just in a little different way. And lastly, but very importantly, to expand the jail capacity at the time. So the idea was that the committee recommended to the board that they needed 8,940 beds over those 15 years by 2012. So this was an estimate based on all of the system recommendations I just went through with you, because they saw those as a cost savings, because the consultant originally recommended probably closer to 12,000 beds. So using all sorts of complicated calculations, they said, well, by doing all these things, you're going to save about 2,887 beds. And so that was the recommendation. And yes, by December of 2012, there were just over 9,000 beds. And all of this, of course, means that the committee had recommended to the board that they seek authority from the legislature for a voter-approved 1/3 of a cent sales tax. And then I can't leave without just talking really quickly about the juvenile system recommendations. So this slide's a little bit of word salad, but I'll try to explain where I was headed with this. So if you see this chart, the committee and the consultants were looking at over a 5-year period a 42% increase in average daily population of juveniles within the detention system. So thinking about that, and also there was a proposition that was passed that they didn't really consider, but you can think about, they probably wanted to allow flexibility for it. The year before, Proposition 102, which was juvenile justice reform, was passed by the voters, and it required that defendants over 15 that committed a violent felony would be charged as adults, but it otherwise gave the county attorney the ability to defer prosecution for nonviolent crimes. So in summary, the consultant said that there should be detention services available for 780 juveniles. Now, I shouldn't have put beds up there. It was more like they said detention services because they wanted to kind of leave it wide open. And then you had heard from Eric in May when he presented about juvenile probation and detention, that things have really changed over the last 27 years. The thinking shifted to focus on diversion, community-based intervention, and there were sentencing changes as well. So in conclusion, I just want to read for you a closing statement that the committee made to the board. I thought you'd enjoy hearing this. They said, providing for the public safety of the citizens of Maricopa County is not an inexpensive proposition. The budgets for the police agencies, courts, prosecutors, public defenders, and other related agencies totaled billions of dollars over the next 15 years. Maricopa County alone will spend more than $1.5 billion on jail and detention facilities in the next 15 years with no new jail or related facilities and programs. Such a critical public safety program cannot be equitably or prudently funded with the property tax authority Maricopa currently has as its only source of funds. The legislature must assist in providing fair and equitable options. So that's how they concluded their report. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Are there questions or comments? It appeared in your summary that, in general, what was desired was the outcome. And so
That's right.
thank you for validating
Right,
that.
Mr. Chair. Yeah, thank you.
Let's move to the next agenda item.
I'll just stay sitting here. Yeah. So I think I might turn it over to Danny here. So you all have before you a list of ideas that we've kind of come up with based on what we've heard you all say, what you've seen. There was a really robust discussion a few meetings ago too. And so that's what you see before you. So I'm not sure how you want to handle moving forward.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, so I've distributed this list to everyone to look through. As Paige said, we've kind of tried to capture comments that have been made by this committee to kind of start the ball rolling on what you may all see as the recommendations going forward. And so I don't know if you want to go through these individually or if you guys just want to kind of have an open discussion about what you all think. It's up to you, Mr. Chair.
I'm open for committee suggestions on that. I see that there are 3 major categories and there are 10 items. And so to the committee, do you have any feedback on the question that Danny just asked?
Mr. Chairman, it might be helpful, at least for the record, to kind of have staff walk through the background on the recommendations and kind of remind us the connection between what we heard, and then if there were others that maybe didn't get quite as much discussion throughout the course so far, to just help us fill that in so that we can contemplate what that draft
It's a great suggestion. From a committee perspective, any committee members have different feelings on that? Because otherwise we'll have Paige give us a quick overview.
Okay. So I'll go ahead and start with
Danny,
the first
please.
category, information and data recommendations. So I think that we've kind of heard several times talking about recidivism and rates, and what we've learned when we're talking and hearing from all these departments is everyone measures that differently. And we're in an interesting situation with having so many pre-trial individuals. So we thought that maybe an ongoing suggestion would be a statewide system. I know there's been pushes in recent years with the legislature for a statewide uniform system, and so that's kind of where that came out of, was those discussions about recidivism and us kind of hearing from the departments that they all measure this somewhat differently. So it's hard to really get a concrete number. Okay. Any questions on that one or thoughts?
So I guess, Mr. Chair, if you have it, that'd be great, but I wonder if you have any more details about like what that system looks like, or if there's an ongoing proposal that you'd be suggesting that we jump onto, or are we thinking of suggesting that the county leads something new?
So ACJC has pursued funding for a statewide system the last couple of years, and I think that those conversations are ongoing because all of the different entities have different data. So it really is a long-term effort to figure out how you can make it all clear and all kind of speak in the same language. And so you may recall I went to that criminal justice symposium at the beginning of this committee, and that was one of the big topics, is how do we make our data match your data, make attorneys' data match jail and prison data so that it's more clear. So I don't have a specific recommendation, but I do think that those talks are ongoing with all of these public safety entities.
So, I mean, I guess to get a little bit more specific about this, because that's a really long-term project. And so I wonder if what we can suggest is that within the county, where there is control, that there is a very clear definition developed, and I know that adult probation uses a different measure of recidivism, for example, than the sheriff's office does, but that everybody develops their recommendation or their definitions of recidivism, and that that information is shared among all of the county entities. That's an interim strategy where there is the ability to have some control, and that data, those definitions, are used to begin to measure the outcomes of each of those programs according to how they define recidivism. So, for example, in talking about programming, just substance abuse treatment, that those definitions are used in order to really determine what is the outcome of the programming, how are people selected for the programming. There's a lot of information that has been developed within the county about using different models like the risk needs responsivity model that can really determine who should be getting programming, so that we now have information. Well, I'll wait for that until we get to programming. Never mind. So that's my comment about recidivism.
Thank you.
Yes, we should. I think we agree. We probably all agree that we should continue to move towards an ability to share information with ACJC, but that's going to be a long-term project. There are things that can be done within the county, I think, and I would recommend that with respect to our committee.
Okay.
So maybe when I revise this, we kind of bring it less global, more local, and then that'll kind of help us do a shorter-term goal.
Shorter-term goal with an aspirational goal.
An aspirational long-term goal. Okay, I like that. Okay, we will make that note and we will change that. Thank you, Dr. Noggle. If there's anything else, or you want me to move on to the next?
Yeah, anything else on number 1? Number 2?
So at our last meeting, we heard from ASU on their detention officer recruitment and retention study. One of our committee members had asked, will we have the data in time? And the reality is that study won't be done until next year. So I thought it would be nice, considering that study is something that we've heard about a lot as a committee, which is the vacancy issue, and in all public safety, but specifically for detention officers. So almost more of a placeholder that once the county participate in that study and we implement some of the findings to try and kind of fix that vacancy issue. Any questions or?
Want to consider broadening that study, because the study will be not only done after we're done, but probably will be done before any potential sales tax goes to a voter. I mean, it's going to be finished, so maybe this gives you the opportunity to participate in it after, right? So
Yeah. Absolutely. And just so you all know, I did go to the opening meeting for that with ACO, so the kind of the sheriff's side, and the CSA, the county supervisor side. And I know that we have people from our budget office and the sheriff's office kind of really ingrained in that are doing the interviews and working on it. So it really is a collaborative study. So hopefully it will be a positive outcome. If there's no questions on that one, we can move on to programming and courts recommendations. So this one's a little broad, but I think that there's been a lot of conversation during this process about, our programs that keep people out of facilities. And when we're talking specifically detention fund, that really is focused on adult and juvenile probation and their probation services. And so that's what this one is, just to make sure that if the funding is extended, we maintain sufficient funding for those FTEs. Any questions on that one?
Question, but what I saw when I was riding with the probation officer was really eye-opening. But I'm also concerned about what happens after probation is over for a lot of the folks that have been released and they get off probation, because it just seems like once the help is gone, that the recidivism potentially comes back into play again because they don't have anywhere to go and they just resort back. So I don't know what that means, other than someone maybe here with a little bit more experience might be able to come up with a goal as to what do we do after that, because it just seems like it's so hard for anybody to recover after that. It's hard enough already when you haven't gone through the court system and have a court record and all those other kind of things, but what do these human beings do after the umbilical cord is cut? And unfortunately, I think the cycle probably comes back around again. So maybe that's a goal under the next period of time for something that we can do along that. And shoot, I don't even know, I mean, housing may even be an issue associated with that. Probably too much for us to bite off, but it just seems like you leave a halfway house that you're getting lots of support for and you know, probably funded. You got nowhere to go. What do you do next? And I think it's pretty clear what happens after that, you know. So just thoughts. We're just throwing things out. That's on my mind to throw out. What do we do after that? And how can we make things better in this next period of 20 years for that purpose? That's the end. Sorry.
Jason?
Let the rest of the committee go first.
Okay.
I think to your point, again, it's kind of like the previous issue. This really requires more effort by other parties and stakeholders, but perhaps one of the goals could be that the county continues to play a role in encouraging the community services such as the behavioral health system, which has housing vouchers that can be used to be responsive to people that are justice involved. So there are efforts like that underway, but I think that specifically we could make a recommendation, and we can work on wordsmithing that around the need for the county to continue to encourage the behavioral health system and other community services to be responsive to the needs of justice-involved people.
Yeah, maybe it has to do with grant programs. I mean, we have community development block grant committees for programs, federal money that comes in, but maybe that's how the county finds a way to do it. I don't know the answer. It's not my thing, but I think it's a need that would be keep people out of the system longer.
There is a health system, the safety health system, that access, and many of the people that are justice involved are eligible for those health services. And those are comprehensive health services, which means that if they need substance use treatment, mental health treatment, ongoing medical needs or health needs, that system is designed to help people. The problem has been that for people that are justice involved, once they get into jail, sometimes they fall out of care. Their case managers perhaps might not be following them. And so that system needs to understand that while people are temporarily in the jail, they continue to have their health home with those providers outside. So what the county can do and has done and needs to continue to do is to open the doors for those providers to be able to come and connect with people while they're incarcerated, but to encourage them to understand that it is their population. We house them in the county temporarily, but we are not their housing nor their health care provider beyond the time in which they're incarcerated.
Please, Jason.
Yeah, I think Dawn actually covered all of it, other than I might suggest that the probation services groups maybe provide us some feedback on whether they have sufficient information about those community services to provide the sort of offboarding briefings for the participants, so that at least they've got some handle on what it is, if it's a packet of information to go pursue this, even if the county is not the one providing those services. I'm sure they do it already, but if we encourage them to take another look and and identify any shortcomings there, that'd be probably helpful.
And this is an interesting and I think timely conversation. So there has been some pushes at the federal level, if I put on my government relations hat, to work on the inmate exclusion for Medicaid. And so there has been a couple of changes for juveniles in recent years so that juveniles can still be on government services when they're incarcerated. And so I think that actually is one of the county's federal priorities, is to support that change. And so it is a timely discussion. I know that Medicaid or Access is currently redoing their 115 waiver, and they're looking at community transition for incarcerated people specifically. So it is a timely conversation, that community transition piece that we're talking about.
And then one other thing, and Paige, thank you. You mentioned the efforts that have been made. There were a lot of recommendations in 1997 really for improvement with the court system. And while there has been some diversion programming and some recommendation or some referrals to diversion by the county attorney's office, it has been very limited compared to what it can be. So I really think that that needs to be a very specific recommendation. I understand that the county attorney is separately elected, but I think if we're looking at decreasing costs overall, decreasing recidivism, we know from research that that takes keeping people out of the system, minimizing the amount of time they're in the system. Far more people could be moved through diversion than are, and I think that that is a very significant need that needs to be addressed with the county attorney's office.
Mr. Chair, if I may, thank you, Dr. Noggle. And just a couple things. I think what Chief Tobin was saying, using the term wraparound services can kind of be a loaded term, but that's what we're talking about here, about all the things the county does, the community stakeholders. There's job training as well that could be had, people who are kind of coming off of probation. But on the diversion front, we do have a report. It's an annual report from the county attorney's office that is specific to their diversion numbers. So maybe we could share that with you all after this so that you can just see it, and we can think about if we want to put a presentation on in the future or ask them to come talk to us about that while we're developing this recommendation.
So I would like to ask if that's done, that we see figures as far back as they have them to really look at what the trend has been.
Okay, great, thank you.
Please continue.
All right, so the second one under programming is prioritize substance abuse treatment and mental health programming throughout the criminal justice system. I think we've all heard a lot and seen a lot on the tours, and that's kind of where this one stemmed from. Thoughts or questions?
Yes.
May I, Mr. Chair? So at some point, we're going to get more specific about all this, so I can withhold my comments. I'm assuming we'll get more.
So I tried to kind of do some broad what I've heard so that you all could discuss what specifics you all want. So we're going to have a discussion today. We're going to have a discussion at the next meeting. So anytime you want to go down.
So, I mean, pardon me, I don't mean to be taking all of the. So one of the things I would say is that, and this is to your point, Chief Tobin, that we recommend that mental health programming and substance abuse programming continues to occur in such a way that the standards by the National Correctional Health Committee services is met, and that all court orders, so that we're abiding by Grays versus whatever. That's a way to avoid further costs with lawsuits and to stay on top of what those needs are. I would also recommend that when we talk about prioritizing substance abuse treatment and mental health programming, that we again use evidence-based practices that have already been established in the county, so that substance use programming is going to the people that have the highest need, and that the services are done in a manner that are responsive to that need, rather than simply being offered on the basis of people who are volunteering for services. There are now wonderful programs through the tablets that can be used since there are limited services, they should be prioritized to the people that need them the most.
Any other thoughts you've got at this point, or do you want
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I'm done.
to? We value your experience and your insight. Okay. Continue on.
All right, so number 3 under programming, coordinate with the courts on the schedule for initial appearance hearings at the intake, transfer, and release facility, and to try to avoid any bottlenecks from those courts. So this is something we talked about in our first kind of discussion about this, and something we saw on the tour. So that one is a little more specific than the other ones. Any thoughts or questions on that one?
I think that's a desire.
Okay, then we will move on to capital recommendations. So these are some of the kind of bigger things that we saw through the jail master plan. The first one is kind of an overall, so, construct the facilities that are going to be beyond their, suggested life. So Estrella and Towers were the 2 that the jail master plan suggested replacing and tearing down over the 15-year period. And then we kind of put some language in there about, the appropriate healthcare space, the appropriate staff areas, and programming, clinical, and pharmacy space. Those are things that we heard from correctional health that were their priorities in any new facilities. I think we saw some pretty tight clinical spaces on some of the jails that have been expanded. And so I think in the jail master plan, one of the priorities they talked about was making sure there was enough programming and clinical space. If there's no questions on that one. Number 2, again, a little bit more of a specific one. I think we heard from facilities and the consultant who did the jail master plan that the ideal timing would be to do a jail refresh every 10 years. That gives you enough time to do the operational side of the study and employment side of the study as well, and then also gives you kind of a planning horizon for the end of the 15 years. So moving on to number 3, if there's no questions on that one. So prioritize improvements of the ITR to alleviate congestion issues and increase security, including improvements to the intake area. So this was a big thing that we heard about from the consultants of the jail master plan, and a big thing that, as we were standing outside of the intake, I think we saw maybe the hardening of that intake area and some security there. So that one we put on there. The next one, increase security of Durango campus and provide a clearer release path for those leaving the ITR. So that's another thing that was in the jail master plan, just for security purposes. And if there's no questions on that one, the last one was pending the results of the juvenile detention facility assessment, implement our recommendations. So as we've talked about, now that the Arrington Watkins is done with the jail master plan, which focuses on adult facilities, they're going and taking a look at the juvenile facility to do a facility assessment. So that's more of a placeholder that those facilities should also be considered in the future funding. So that is what I have. Is there anything else that I'm missing?
Mr. Chairman, Danny, are these draft recommendations in a priority order from staff, or are we just sort of like going with a list and then we should talk about what the priorities are?
This is very preliminary. It's just,
Okay.
I tried to bundle them kind of by category, but no, there is not a priority order.
Should there be?
Yeah, yes.
Okay.
I think that would make sense to do. Especially if we have 2 or 3 like really top ones, if we want to put those at the very beginning as like your number 1 priorities, we definitely could separate those out. I was just trying to follow Paige's presentation with the kind of different categories she outlined to see there is kind of some categorization here as well.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think even within the buckets, probably some prioritization probably makes some sense.
Mr. Chair.
Our consultant that's going to come to us with recommendation, how is that going to match with what this is a list of stuff that we've talked about? So I'm assuming we're going to try and find out how these all come together. They'll have some additional potential recommendations that we'll either agree to or not agree to, right? And maybe some of these will be in there.
Yeah, so I definitely know there will be some crossover. They're really focused on looking at the data of, here's the budget, here's what we've spent it on, here are the things we're mandated to spend money on. And throughout that, there have been some recommendations. So, for example, I was on a call with them yesterday, and they were talking to some of these departments about, why do you all track recidivism differently? So, right, there is some crossover that they're finding, and they're, looking through things. Excuse me. So I do think there will be some crossover in there. I think theirs is maybe, without having seen the final draft, I think, more of an analysis than a series of recommendations, but I think there will be crossover in what they're finding in their analysis.
Page, in your research with the previous committee, did you find a leader of the pack? Like, did you find the person that was the advocate that is still around?
Well, what a great question, Mr. Chair, Chief. I think what I found from the original committee, the chair was very active. And then when they were out at the public meetings, each board member's appointee to that district, for instance, went with the chair and the board of supervisors member. So they were all very active in their own ways. Reading through the minutes, I think a lot of it was a lot of staff presentations, but depending on the topic, there were champions for topics. So for instance, there was a judge that really wanted the drug court stuff. And, you know, you could just kind of tell the different topics. There was a champion on that oversight committee that was like, let's make sure this gets done. So it's kind of a general answer, but there were. I'd have to kind of go through and remind myself who they were and what their topics were.
Yeah, because we're all, well, not all of us. Some of us are really new,
Yeah.
right? So we don't even know what to ask sometimes. And I
Yeah.
wonder whether or not we're recreating the wheel sometimes, or maybe there might be a person, I don't know, I'm just speaking out loud, that's just
Yeah.
generally how I think, that would say, hey, this is where we left off, maybe you ought to consider this. I don't know, but they put a lot of time and effort into it and made a lot of progress. So
Yeah.
maybe there's a pickup point from there with like I said, the leader.
That's a
chairman
good
or
idea. That's a good idea. And I think, without saying it, we've all seen, you all have specific interests about what all this is. So Danny and I can kind of tell, like, oh, well, Dr. Noggle thinks this way about these programs. So we know that about you, but I see what you're saying about maybe for the future, how do we make sure that your recommendations or you know, the board understands. And I like what you said about priorities. I think it will help the board understand. It kind of helps the board have some flexibility. If you're like, these are our recommendations, but these are the priorities that this committee, the Citizens Committee saw, I think that'll help them.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, can I ask, a few times in this conversation, we talked about some like longer term issues and maybe things that might need some more specialized participants. So I'm just throwing out there, do you think there'd be any interest in a recommendation for some type of longer term? So for example, last time they did it to have oversight over building the new facilities and they looked at the recommendations. One thing we could consider is if there's a couple of these things that seem longer term, maybe some of the recidivism and the diversion, things like that, maybe that needs to be, you know, if this tax is continuing away, there's a follow-up committee that looks into some of these specific longer term, bigger issues than what this committee can get through in 6 months. So I'm not making that recommendation, I'm just throwing out there that there is a precedent from the last committee to create a future committee to look at kind of some specific items.
Any feelings on that thought of having another committee formed after, just to give oversight and keep things going?
Mr. Chairman, how's your calendar for the next 10 years?
It won't meet bi-weekly.
We are passionate about this and didn't know. But we do want to let other people have opportunities.
I guess the question that I would have is, so rather than creating an oversight committee, if it's duplicative, who or what group within the county is it that will be monitoring these things? Like there used to be the whole organization within county that was looking at doing all of the research around this, and I don't know what happened to that. That would be like a natural, if you have something already embedded within the county that could be charged with this. So that would be my question. There's no need to create something if there's already some monitoring mechanisms within.
Maybe more like a criminal justice coordinating committee that's internal stakeholders that are focused on issues. Okay, that's.
So if we could hear about that, like what's going on with that now, because I know that that was a very active part of what was going on and what was driving some of this programming around, looking at evidence-based practices.
There was a smart justice
Yeah,
committee.
all of that. And I don't know what's going
Yeah.
on with that now, but so rather than creating something separate, if there is already an entity doing that, then we could simply make a recommendation to support the work of that.
Okay, yeah, absolutely.
Mr. Chairman, I might add to that, and would be curious about Paige and Danny's experience with this, but did that ongoing committee's work and the record that was created for that in the public assist you all in gathering the history and where we came through? Because I think there may be a value in having a more public-facing structure to help keep that up as it goes on, so that the institutional knowledge doesn't get lost over time.
That's a good point. I sure did appreciate being able to read all those minutes. It was interesting, but that's a good point.
We do. We definitely have utilized the several drawers that my department has of all the stuff they've gone through. So yes, we did utilize that quite a bit. And you're right, I think there is like a mental health, I can't remember, it's a task force that is, I think, a kind of offshoot of what Smart Justice or McJustice kind of was before. And so let's look into that, and then maybe we can talk offline about how we could maybe shape that where it maybe fits within the county context and maybe has a public-facing element as well. But rather than recreate the wheel, maybe try and, okay, great.
And I do have one more question, and I think I saw something in the last meeting, but there's an examination of creating whatever the facility is going to be for people who are sentenced. And I guess I'm very curious about whether or not any other alternatives have been looked at, like what is done across the country, where people don't necessarily come back into a facility. There are liabilities with that. People check into hotels, or they have electronic monitoring. So I don't know I haven't seen a lot about that, like what's being proposed. So I'm just curious when we're going to hear that. I know, obviously, tents has gone away, but that building was being used for people who were coming back, like on work release.
Yes, I get what you're saying. Yes, the work release that was mentioned in the presentation.
Since it's now kind of been moved into Estrella, I think that the recommendation from the jail master plan was to create a standalone work release facility, because it shouldn't be as high security as a jail, but they would still check in and stay there overnight as they do currently at Estrella. It would be a separate outbuilding from the jail facility.
So my question is whether or not there's been an exploration of what alternatives there might be to having a facility.
Okay. I don't know that there has been.
Okay. Can we ask if it could be looked at? Or that could potentially be something that we could make a recommendation about?
Thank you. I think you just did. So let's to the committee. Any other feedback related to agenda item 9? Oh, excuse me, that was agenda item 8.
I guess, Mr. Chairman, just can you lay out, or maybe it'll be in your director's report, but can you give us a sense of like the timeline for the iterations on the recommendations and how you see that playing out as we're getting closer to?
Yeah.
Is that a good segue to 9?
Great segue. I actually
right.
don't have it in my director's report, so it's a good question. Paige, will you go ahead and click to the director's report? Okay. And you go to the next one. Okay, so we'll talk through next week. We're going to have our consultants come and give their findings. So I've been starting to get drafts that they're sharing with the departments to do a kind of final read over. So hopefully we will have that on the 26th. We'll have public health and medical examiner coming in to give a presentation. Also something we discussed last week or 2 weeks ago. We'll have an outreach plan. So we have someone who's working on the public-facing webinars. Those are going to be scheduled for later in October. So they're going to come and just give a quick presentation on the status of that. And then we're going to have, to your point, Jason, our second discussion of your potential recommendations. So timeline-wise, what we were thinking is that we can kind of take back what we heard today, refine this, maybe reach out to some of you individually on some of these things to kind of run past what you think, have another discussion next week or 2 weeks from now. And then our hope is that on October 10th, so 2 meetings from now, there will be some adoption of a staff memo that has your guys' recommendations in it, and then has attached the, the consultant report, the jail master plan, and then we'll go into webinars. So our thinking is we'll have one more lengthy discussion here. You guys will adopt something in a draft form on the 10th. We'll do some webinars, and then hopefully in early November, mid-November, depending on timing, you guys will finalize that and make a final recommendation. And I think that there is the one outstanding obvious issue, which is to talk about if, legislatively what you all recommend based on all of these findings. Our thinking was it'd be best to go to the public webinars, get public feedback, and then have that discussion after the public webinars about what you guys recommend legislatively. Because as Paige said last time, there was a series of recommendations, and then they said, in order to do these recommendations, we think you should pursue a X sales tax. Does that answer your question? Okay. I know it's a little tight, but we're coming up on holiday season, so there's not that many every other Thursdays left for us to go. So actually, I think I just went over everything on my next slide, so if there's no other questions, I think we're all done unless there's any more discussion or questions for me.
Any more discussion from the committee today? Then, the
Very good.
appreciation again. We start off with appreciation, and then to all the help and those who have participated, thank you. Meeting adjourned.